Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final event of the India-Australia Economic Strategy Series with a spotlight on Australia-India research collaboration. I'm Haripriya Rangan, Principal Consultant of Government Projects for the Australia-India Institute, and I'm delighted to be guiding today's discussion as the chair of this event. We're speaking today and meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. Today, it's exciting for us because we're both in person and online. Welcome to all those who are joining us virtually. It's great to have you with us. This is the fourth event in the series that brings together policymakers and the education sector to consider the impact, opportunity, and risks of India's Australia economic strategy with a focus on education. These forums are supported by the Australian Government Department of Education. The previous three forums in this series explored the topics of EdTech, micro-credentials, and vocational education training in schools in Australia and India. Our main agenda for today is to talk about the dynamic landscape of research collaboration between India and Australia, a field that has seen remarkable growth over the past decade. We'll be delving into the current trends in bilateral research collaboration. We'll also explore opportunities for interdisciplinary research at the intersection of STEM and HAS, discuss the practical benefits of diversified research models, and identify areas that deserve future attention and investment. But before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to welcome the CEO of Australia-India Institute, the Honourable Lisa Singh, to share a few opening remarks. Over to you, Lisa.
Thank you very much, Priya, and it's a delight to be here with those in the room here at the Melbourne Business School and also those on screen in this hybrid format for this important event. But particularly excited to be joined by our esteemed panellists that we're going to hear from today from both Australia and India, as of course we are delving into the Australia-India research relationship through this India-Australia Economic Strategy Series. As Priya said, you know, this is a series, and that's the sort of beauty of this, because it means we can actually go back through the previous series of sessions as they are all recorded to actually see, you know, how we are actually building upon layer, building our knowledge and understanding of what we're going to delve into today in the research sense. Of course, there is no better time for us in the current landscape to be engaging in a panel discussion on interdisciplinary research collaboration between Australia and India. Our bilateral education relationship, in fact, has seen remarkable progress this year. Reflecting on my recent visit a couple of weeks ago to India, where we hosted Australia's Education Minister, the Honourable Jason Clare, for the Institute's annual oration in Gandhinagar as part of his Australia-India Education and Skills Council meeting. It really was inspiring to witness the positive strides that we are making together in research collaboration. During that visit, Minister Clare announced a series of key initiatives. It included a new Australia-India education strategy to guide and to strengthen our partnership, as well as funding for Maitri scholarship programs to support emerging Indian researchers to study in Australia. And of course, he also announced, and I was delighted that he did so, renewed funding for the Australia-India Institute over the next 3 years to enable us to continue our important work in strengthening the learning, skilling and research engagement between our two countries. Please come in. The way we do that, of course, we support Australia's comprehensive strategic partnership. We support the Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement. and we prioritise opportunities to strengthen engagement in line with India's national education policy. One of our recent and most exciting initiatives is a digital platform called Arch India. Arch India, of course, stands for the Australia Research Cooperation Hub India. And Arch India really serves as an online space connecting researchers, fostering collaboration, and providing mobility opportunities between our two countries through that important work that researchers do and collaborate on. Through Arch India, we've also been able to run two key programs this year, supported by the Australian Government's Department of Education. One, the Australia-India Research Students, or as we like to call them, AIRS Fellowships, supported 60 Australian and Indian research students and early career researchers to undertake short-term exchanges between each other's countries. Up to 8 weeks, we welcomed Indian researchers to Australia, many for the first time, and similarly for Australian researchers partnering with institutions in India, researching and collaborating through their research. We're looking forward at seeing the fruits of that in terms of following the case studies of their work into the future. And the other one we delivered was the Australia-India Unnati Research Collaboration Grants, which offered up to $30,000 to Australian researchers for collaborating with their Indian partners and peers across 4 priority areas of mutual importance. And then finally, I was just mentioning to the panel that we just recently launched in India the Mapping Higher Education Engagement between Australia and India, a compendium report, which provides a guide for universities and governments in both countries to draw on the experiences of over the past 15 years of expanding and diversifying their existing partnerships, academic and student exchanges, doctoral training and research collaborations. And what it did show is that there are over 400 sorts of partnerships between Australia and India higher education engagement. It's really quite extensive, and I'm sure that report's probably out of date already, as there were a number of MOUs signed even during the recent trip with the 2 ministers. So I just really wanted to welcome everyone online and in the room here in Melbourne Business School today for this important panel. Thank our esteemed panellists, looking forward to their engaging interactions and hearing from them as experts, their insights on the future for Australia and India's education partnership, particularly through this important realm of research, which really, as we know, helps solve some of the shared challenges that both of our two countries face. And of course, I look forward to continuing these conversations around STEM and HASS research, the collaboration, and continue that growth and success that our education partnership between Australia and India continues to offer. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. I think we'll get started, and I'd like to introduce our speakers. I'll start with Ambassador Anil Wadhwa. He has served as ambassador to Italy, Thailand, Oman, and Poland. As secretary in the ministry, he oversaw relations with Southeast Asia, Gulf and West Asia, Pacific and Australasia, and headed a CII task force. That's, I think, the Council of Confederation of Indian Industry. Task force to write the Australia Economic Strategy Report for the Indian government. Currently, he's a distinguished fellow at the New Delhi-based Vivekananda International Foundation and serves as an independent director on the boards of some corporate firms. Go on to Associate Professor Janaki Srinivasan, who is a faculty member at the International Institute of Information Technology at Bangalore and the convener of the Institute's Center for Information Technology and Public Policy. Besides the politics of information technology-based development, her current research examines various aspects of digital labor, including algorithmic control and fairness in gig work and automation. Professor Robin Batterham, AO, was a member of the Australia-India Council for 10 years and has been involved with the Australia-India Strategic Research Fund for many years. He recently chaired the Net Zero Australia project and is the CTO of a green steel project. His interests cover energy systems, soil carbon, and mineral processing, especially of critical minerals. Professor Susan Dodds Faha is Senior Deputy Vice Chancellor and Vice President, Research and Industry Engagement, and Professor of Philosophy at La Trobe University. Her research focuses on issues in applied ethics and political philosophy, and she's recognized nationally and internationally for her leadership in research ethics and public policy development related to emerging medical technologies. In 2022, she was appointed to the Australian Research Council Advisory Committee by the Minister of Education. And joining us online is Dr. Chris Haverley. Chris commenced as CEO of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia in 2019. Previously, he was the Director, Science Policy at the Australian Academy of Science and the National Research Manager with Alzheimer's Australia. Chris has a PhD in cognitive psychology from the ANU and has more than 10 years experience working at the interface of research, policy, service delivery, and community. Thank you all for being with us today and taking part in this discussion. So without any delay, I will start by asking Professor Batterham about his work in this very, very important field of trying to build research collaborations between Australia and India. So the collaboration in STEM has been absolutely foundational. And I must clarify, for anyone in the audience who's wondering what we mean by STEM and HASS, I must explain that by STEM, we refer to science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And when we say HASS, we mean humanities and social sciences. So you'll hear that a lot from us now. So you've been involved foundationally in STEM, research collaboration between Australia and India. And one of the most important roles you've played in this is being the expert involved in the process of the Australia-India Strategic Research Fund selection process. So what we'd love to hear from you is some observations on how this landscape of bilateral STEM engagement has evolved over the years, and what are some of the key factors that are shaping these trends? What do you think how does it translate into economic development? So it'd be great if you could speak for about 10 minutes.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you, Lisa, as well, also for the invitation. Yeah, it's great to be here. This is an exciting area and one which has had a lot going in it, but it's got to have a lot more. And it's also one, let me say at the outset, in which there's quite extraordinary opportunities. And the question today is how to make them happen. Now, I could at this stage hand over to Professor Mohan Yelashetty, who has joined us here, because he's one of the people who is actually making them happen. So if we end up with any questions, guess where they're going to go? So let me get to the core of the question. There has been a lot going on in STEM. Now, I'm not sure that I qualify for STEM. After all, I know I ended up being Chief Scientist of Australia, but my degree is in engineering, excuse me. Next, and my first qualifications at tertiary level were in music, thank you very much, not in STEM or HASS. HASS, I don't like that term because it's the German word for hate. And we have a bit too much of that in the world at the moment, but I'm not sure, Chris, what we can do about that because it's fairly well entrenched. So to get to the core, there's been a lot happening in STEM, and I think this is partly because people in the science and engineering areas like to talk to each other anyway. They swap notes, they build on each other. they're shameless stealers of ideas, but always with full recognition, of course, and due acknowledgement, certainly in my experience, because ideas build on ideas and experience builds on experience. And we could spend an awful lot of time on that. And because both in India and in Australia, there is so much going on in pushing back the boundaries, the notion that we can opportunistically look at that and turn it into the realities that change the world, particularly our own worlds, you have to take that one to heart. Now, so my first point is there's been a lot happening. There will continue to be a lot happening. It takes time. We have to be patient. Getting small collaborations is the seed that then grows into larger collaborations, that then becomes institutional and with companies involved as well. So there's a process in which we have to be patient, but it is working. So my next point, and if I could make 3 points, I'm told people can never remember more than 3 points, but I don't really believe that. So first point is patience needed. Now, next point is that when we look at where India is heading, where Australia is heading, and we can get on to the rest of the world, but let's stick to the topic. What's very clear is that we're in a changing world geopolitically, the rate of change speeding up, not just geopolitically, but technically and socially as well. We've moved into a social environment whereby suicide rates are climbing at an alarming level. They've had 2 blips. One of them was when Instagram came in, and one of them was when TikTok came in. And this is heading into epidemic proportions. And to go blithely ahead, just concentrating on STEM, or dare I say, being totally ignorant of the area, just concentrating on the HASS side, isn't going to solve this social problem of individuals are the only thing that matters. That's a descent into, this is a very philosophic point, folks. That's a descent into barbarism, I might add, and anarchy. So we've got to think through how can we get the best of all worlds in? How can we get the way people thinks not to be an impediment to collaboration, but to actually be a door opener? So second point is we do actually have to be far more multidisciplinary. Then my last one is one of just straight out opportunity. And this straight out opportunity is fairly simple. If we pick the big energy change that is necessary to get emissions down, and it is necessary, Australia and India are in quite unique positions. Australia's in this unique position because it has much of the resources required for the energy transition, be it just straight sunlight, I might add, and wind energy and so forth, but be it also critical minerals and the like, where Australia really is just extraordinarily well endowed. India also has the sunlight. It rains a fair bit sometimes in some places, unlike in Australia. But leaving that as an aside, India has a much better developed manufacturing industry. And I'm not going to say anything about the size of it or the drive behind it or anything like that. You can pull the figures out yourself and look at it. This is a fairly obvious major union. And I would look at something like critical minerals, but this shouldn't be the only one that we look at to say, this is a major opportunity writ large. How do we make it happen? Professor Yelashetty could give us some details, but there's being set up, and it will happen, an Australia-India critical minerals research hub, and it'll be more than just research teaching and so on. The Indian side has already come to the party, I think it's fair to say. The Australian side, unless it's changed in the last week or so, has still to come to the party, but with a bit of encouragement, I'm sure it will happen. So the 3 points, and I've finished with the third one. There are many opportunities around. We need to get some strategic focus on some of the big ones that just happen to suit the capabilities in both countries and the global needs. And there are plenty of them. Thanks for the chance.
Thank you so much, Batam. I'll do that. Thank you. We'll now join in. We'll now move on to Ambassador Anil Wadhwa. And Ambassador Wadhwa, this is a question that comes actually from the work that you did and the report that you prepared, the Australia Economic Strategy from the Indian perspective. You emphasize the importance of research and innovation in the new and emerging areas as one of the pillars for solidifying the relationship between the two countries. I think what you also importantly emphasized, which we greatly appreciated from the Institute, was the need to not just deepen the existing research ties, but to broaden and diversify it, and to look beyond just the technology areas. So what kinds of cross-sectoral opportunities or areas that do you see that can make the bilateral research ecosystem more interdisciplinary? 5 minutes.
So thank you. Yes, so if I go back to the areas identified in the economic strategy report, of course, science was on top of it. Technology was on top, and that's because the relationship, as we saw it, was going to be driven through technology and innovation in the future. But having said that, I think there was also a very important finding that there was a lot of interest in India in the business schools in Australia. And sitting here in the Melbourne Business School, I think that's a good point that I must make, because there are certain disciplines here in Australia which are now coming into focus in India. And it was just emerging at that point in time, especially the services side of business, branding of business, and also marketing of business. And that's something which is happening a lot now in India. It's coming to the fore. So besides that, there is also a second aspect, which is the collaboration as we saw it, which is important, was not just between universities and institutions, but also between industry-led research institutions. For example, you have the CSIRO in Australia, and we have similar organizations in India. And if you have collaborations between the two of them, then you can diversify a little bit more from technology onto areas which impact everyday life in India. So there were 3 other recommendations which flow from this. One was, of course, to set up an innovation fund of $10 million between India and Australia, something on the lines of the Australia-India Scientific Research Fund. But more importantly, to set up another fund for humanities. And that would be for also for $10 million over a period of 5 years. It was a modest proposal. Now that's something that the governments have to act upon still. They haven't done that because they have focused a lot on innovation, and the way this is being tackled is through what we call the innovation bridges between India and Australia. So the ministries of commerce in the case of India and DFAT in the case of Australia, they already fund innovation. So the funding is coming from that. So they didn't feel the need to set up a separate fund. But on the humanities side, I think it's important because, again, in India, there are disciplines, for example, which are underdeveloped. And I would specifically name sports management, museology, music, art, and the history of art, for instance. These are just a few examples. There are many others. Museology in particular is very important today because India is setting up museums at a rapid pace, which it never used to earlier, ranging from defense to history to art, etc. And every state is doing the same. But there is no expertise. So most of the people are borrowed from universities without actually having, any expertise in it, really speaking. There's a big demand for that, which is only going to grow in future. So these areas are already identified. But then we also had, when we looked at Australia at that point in time, we saw that Australia produces about, more than 2.7% of the world's scientific research with only 0.4% of the population. And it's got some top-notch ranking universities. So with that kind of a talent pool, it was important to have collaborations, not just in STEM, but also in other fields, because that was what the need was in terms of the economy. So when the economy is diversifying as it was in India, that it still is. In fact, it's doing much more today with e-commerce, etc., coming in. So we find that the needs of society have become very critical in terms of this diversification. So how do we diversify from purely STEM onto other areas? And I think we got a glimpse of it when we did the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership in 2020, because we talked about areas like water management, like healthcare, like logistics, also artificial intelligence, critical minerals, of course. But all these require some amount of humanities specialization or an overlap of humanities with STEM, because these are not purely scientific subjects. And they also have to take into account what's happening within the society as far as the economy is concerned, the sociological impact which is happening, how the environment is being tackled, the environmental clearances, etc. Now there, we certainly come into an interplay, and that's also highlighted, by the way, in the Australia-India ECTA. There is a separate paragraph over there, which actually highlights these areas. So the recent visit of Jason Clare to India, in fact, well, he did talk about, besides what Lisa read out to you about the various areas of collaboration, in which we have, joint collaboration and joint degree programs and joint PhD research, etc., and dual degrees, etc. But you also have now the importance of AI coming into the critical areas which affect the government funding in social sectors. You have, for example, critical technologies which are required for logistics, for instance, improving logistics in India, because that's a critical area again. And in infrastructure, again, you need technology, urban planning, for instance. So all that is, I would say, a combination. And therefore, when we look at programs in future, we should be looking at interdisciplinary programs, which actually, I would agree that won't be primarily, as you said, HAS, but it could be an overlap of HAS on STEM. And that requires a collaboration between different departments of universities, both this side and on the other side. So far, we've been having department-to-department collaborations. So whether it's a scientific department, one talking to the other. But here we have, when we're talking about that overlap, you actually require some kind of a degree which covers some aspects of humanities and social sciences as well. So during that program, if you have coverage of a few lectures which have an impact on that particular subject matter, then that should be considered quite carefully. And that's the way to go in the future, in my opinion. Final point that I'd like to make is that even in India, you have cross-cutting disciplines which are now emerging within universities, which was not the case earlier. In fact, when students used to come out of school, they would think only about engineering or becoming a doctor or going into sciences. And somehow humanities were considered second rate. I mean, you wouldn't make it to the sciences, so you would then look at, humanities as a fallback option. Because at that point, not many options were available by way of professions in India. But now the things have changed a lot. And in fact, you have every discipline which requires some bit of humanities as an input. And therefore, the universities are also looking at comprehensive programs which cover something like the US system, a credit system that you get in terms of different inputs. And Delhi University, for one, is already a university who started it 5 years ago. So something similar is happening across the board in many universities, preparing for the future. And there, I think Australia has an advantage and should take advantage of this trend. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Wadhwa. I'm now going to invite Dr. Hatherley to speak. And the question I have for you, Chris, is the Australian Learned Academies are a strong advocate for evidence-based interdisciplinary research. And they also have a number of fellows from the Indian diaspora background. So while international STEM collaboration is pursued through formal agreements, a lot of HAS partnerships have historically been less formalized and more dependent on individual researcher to researcher relations. Now, I'd like to make a little observation, while preparing for this, this seminar, this discussion, I suddenly remembered C.P. Snow's famous lecture, right, of the two cultures of the scientific revolution. And he talked about this divide between the arts and the sciences and the inability to effectively communicate between them. But he said that some 60 plus years ago. And since then, there's been a lot of disciplinary diversification and between the two broad cultures, and there are many interdisciplinary fields now. But somehow in the minds of policymakers and administrators, a lot of the people who have power to allocate resources, this divide seems to persist. This mental divide seems to persist. So what do you identify as some of the key drivers of addressing this problem and also thinking about it in terms of the research engagement between India and Australia? Over to you, Dr. Hatherley.
Well, thank you, Lisa, and thanks, Priya. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very sorry I couldn't be there in person this afternoon. I've got small children and pick-up arrangements that couldn't be shifted, unfortunately, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to join online, and I'm joining from the lands of the Ngunnawal people, and I just quickly acknowledge their traditional elders, past, present, and emerging. So there was a lot in that question. Thank you. I think perhaps before I begin to answer, I'll just reflect on Robin's point about HAS and that particular term, which I don't like either. I'm a German speaker, and it's always jarred when I've heard people speaking about HAS. Our colleagues at the British Academy have started to address this. They've proposed a new frame. SHAPE is their proposal, and it stands for Social Sciences, Humanities and the Arts for People and the Economy, or the environment if you prefer it, so it's interchangeable. But SHAPE is a new framing for HAS that's being pushed by the British Academy and is slowly starting to get traction around the world, including in Australia through our own SHAPE Futures Network for early and mid-career researchers in the associated disciplines. Again, just perhaps before I come to the specifics of your question, a couple of weeks ago, the Australian Academy of Science had a symposium on the topic of international scientific collaboration in a contested world. And it was at the same time as the Australian Parliament was reviewing the proposed amendments to the Defence Trade Control Acts, which was going through just last week. I'm not sure to what extent people are aware of this, but essentially there's new legislation being introduced to Parliament which will effectively make it easier for researchers to collaborate with colleagues in the US and the UK. And this is in part tied up to AUKUS, but it will raise the fence for collaborations almost anywhere else. And that raising of the fence includes an expanded list of defence trade controls and research areas or technologies that fall under that. The list is already 30 pages long and it's growing, including many, many dual-use technologies, which have many other applications apart from defence. And this new legislation also introduces criminal penalties for researchers who even inadvertently collaborate outside of those bounds without permission. So there really is a worsening, almost strategic environment in which research collaborations are taking place. The Australian ambassador to the US, our former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, was reflecting on this at a dinner speech at that conference, and he basically was preempting that research collaboration in the STEM areas will get harder and harder over the coming years, particularly in countries such as China and other parts of Asia, and in relation to many of the emerging technologies such as AI or quantum computing or semiconductors. But conversely, he said at the same time, it seems as though the barriers are opening up for research collaborations in the social sciences and humanities. There's a growing awareness and understanding of the value of international collaboration, addressing some of the big challenges such as social determinants of climate change and the changes in human behaviour and economies that are going to be needed to tackle that, in health and medical research and responding to pandemics, for instance. So I think it's things are changing very quickly, as was mentioned, and whether that makes it easier or more difficult to cross the STEM to humanities and social sciences divide, I'm not sure, but certainly it presents new opportunities as these changes take hold across the world as well. In terms of, I think you're absolutely right, Lisa, that a lot of the collaboration that has taken place has been researcher to researcher collaboration, particularly in the social sciences and humanities. There has been some good examples of institutional collaborations. Our Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia had a long-standing MOU in collaboration with the Indian Council of Social Sciences, as well as the Tata Institute of Social Sciences and a couple of others as well. And that collaboration has expanded and evolved now to become a multilateral partnership, which we coordinate through a group called the Association of Asian Social Science Research Councils. That's ASREC. We manage the office for ASREC out of our academy in Australia, but it's been going for about 50 years. And the Indian Council of Social Sciences is certainly one of the key members. In fact, one of their council members, Professor Singh, holds the chair of ASREC at present. And that through that program, we're looking to try and forge more multilateral agreements. There's a grants program, there's mentoring programs. We've recently broken an agreement with the Canadian government to inject some funding into that Indo-Pacific, collaborative kind of research program, which are really trying to build up those research collaborations and capacity for researchers to address social issues, drawing on all disciplines. So I think there's a lot of promise. There's a lot of cause for optimism. I think Australia, given the many areas of overlapping interest, both in science and technology, but also in the social and humanities issues, there's lots of common interests and common history, even in areas ranging from sport and history and anthropology through to psychology, economics, social welfare. I think there's a growing interest and understanding, as was evidenced by the delegation to India led by Minister Clare a couple of weeks ago, and the new agreements. And I think for organisations in Australia, universities, as well as organisations like our Academy, there's a real opportunity to capitalise on that renewed interest and renewed opportunity to revive and strengthen those links with India.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hathway. I'll now turn to Professor Janaki Srinivasan. Janaki, your work at the intersections of digital economy and social inclusion are very important. It sets an important precedent for applying interdisciplinary approaches in that context of information technology. And in some sense, really breaks the kind of mentality, the siloed mentality of the division between the technologies and the arts and humanities. What are some of the main challenges you've experienced or you've faced in establishing your sort of combined or intersectional approach to research while collaborating with diverse stakeholders? And you've done that both within your own institution, which is predominantly technologically emphasized, and also internationally in all the projects that you've been doing. So yeah, turns on. Is that red? That's good.
Well, it should be good.
I hope it is.
Otherwise, I'll give you mine.
Thanks, Priya, and thanks for the invite to be here. I'm really stimulating to listen to all the previous panelists. As is often the last couple of panelists, we'll do a little bit of summing up here. But first of all, I wanted to add yet another acronym to the alphabet soup. I have heard the term STEAM, which is STEM plus arts. I think STEAM in mind, whether or not we like that. So I wanted to say a little bit and add, Professor, to your point that it takes patience. I would say that collaborations that are across disciplines take even more patience. I wanted to start just within our institute, because even at that stage where you would assume that there are a lot of realities in common, that conversation still takes time to get established. So I co-teach, I think one of the first such courses called Privacy in the Digital Age, in which I participate as a social scientist. A colleague of mine is a public policy and economics person, and we have a computer scientist. And our whole point of teaching that course was to say that, hey, this can't be stir and mix. You can't teach privacy from a technological point and then later on add everything else, right? You have to teach students to think about them simultaneously. And it's taken us years to sort of develop that curriculum, think about how is it that, because it's not an easy thing, even for those of us who come from different disciplines, to talk to each other and then to build something that others can also understand and build on, right? So that's one example. I have, Priya already mentioned that we run the Center for IT and Public Policy, which is very much at the intersections of everything digital and public interest. And by definition, all the work that we do has to be interdisciplinary. We have yet another center called Center for Accessibility in the Global South. And they have been working through more informal settings like hackathons, right? Where you have not just academic players or even corporate, but also civil society, disability studies advocates, for instance, who sort of suggest how to frame the issue in the first place, rather than starting from the technology. So we have tried to also go beyond academia in some of these conversations, and I think that's critical, whether it's domestic or international. There are also a couple of international research projects that I'm involved in that I thought I would just lightly touch on here. And I think here again, it goes back to Ambassador Vadva's point that as markets start expanding, we need to think about who are the kinds of populations that you're building products for. That's one side of it. The other side is also that because very often you have a default user in mind, the people who are not that default and often tend to be vulnerable, marginalized populations, you also need to understand how these technologies that were not built with them in mind in the first place are nevertheless affecting their lives, right? And I'm thinking of something that is equally promising and terrifying, like alternative data for fintech, right? On the one hand, the promise of it is enormous. You see that there are people who are never going to build a credit score in the formal way because they don't have the resource, the collaterals, the assets, etc. And therefore, how great is it that they now have mobile phones? Everyone's carrying around this thing that can, track their data footprints and use that to give them credit. But of course, the flip side of that is, there are going to be people who don't generate even that footprint, so they get excluded. And the others who get included often don't get included on their own terms, right? You have all kinds of issues around privacy and breach and bias and so on and so forth. I'm also involved in another project, which is a global network called Fair Work, which brings out annual ratings of platform-based gig work platforms, the Ubers and the Olas of the world. And in fact, the last time I was here, I was still talking about the same thing. That was 6 years back. So what we do in that case is look at the conditions of gig workers, which is something that's become more talked about in the last couple of years. But before that, very often when we talked about these platforms, we were either talking about jobs being generated or the convenience of the customers. We didn't necessarily talk about the work conditions of the people who are providing these services. So there are all these questions, even to frame them as questions or recognize them as priorities, I think we need diverse kinds of people coming to the table and having that conversation. So absolutely agree with everything that's been said so far about the necessity of having all these different voices. And I think internationally, we have a huge opening because some of these are problems whose solutions might be very local, but I think everyone's facing the same questions. Hence, whichever country you go to, the headlines very often are about ChatGPT. Why is that? Right? Because everyone's problems are localized after all, but we are all seeing the same problems. I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much.
Why don't we fall back? I think we can ask a question. So there you go.
I'll now come to you, Professor Dodds. This is a question about the PhD academies between Australia and India. So what they have been trying to do is nurture academic mobility, meet the emerging needs of workforces in both countries and research capacity of institutions. But again, most of them are STEM focused and they lack opportunities for interdisciplinary research. So, but the La Trobe IIT Kanpur Research Academy is one of the few joint PhD ventures between Australia and India that promotes humanities and social sciences and interdisciplinary research around things like urban planning, governance, community engagement, water, waste, food security, and agriculture. What motivated the inclusion of these themes? How has student engagement fared in these topics? You know, we'd like your input on those questions.
And thank you, Priya. Thank you so much. And it's been fantastic to be a part of this conversation because I think all the things that we were hoping the IIT Kanpur, La Trobe Research Academy would achieve are the kinds of things we've been talking about. The IIT Kanpur La Trobe Research Academy really grew out of the Asian Smart Cities Research and Innovation Network, which was asking those questions about what would a technologically enabled but healthy, connected, socially cohesive city look like into the future. And to answer that question, you can't just have technology do the work. And as we've just heard in the issues related to whether it's AI or IT as a solution to a social problem, there needs to be a lot of work done about the potential for that to create greater social disconnection or to have impacts that lead to inequalities, or that there might be anxieties within the society that you haven't anticipated, so there's no uptake on the technology. So in our work around the Research Academy has been to try to identify those 10 areas that focus on those kinds of global challenges that involve a number of disciplinary areas of expertise, and then create research projects where we bring together supervisors from across disciplines and students who have the opportunity for an experience both in their home institution and to visit the other university for a period of time to really fill out their experience. It's not easy. These things take time and patience to do well, because you not only have the challenge of getting two university systems to work well together. All those of us who've worked in universities know that that's easy. But you also have that kind of concern about what are the disciplinary norms for a PhD that aren't always readily adapted. But if you're working with students who are highly motivated to do things like, address the energy challenge, they know that there's a technology they may be working on from their scientific background, but they actually want it to be one that works. So, I regularly ask the question of students in electrical material science about, okay, you want to have a new way of developing a photovoltaic cell. Fantastic. Try not to use a mineral that comes only in a place where there's huge levels of social tensions and civil war, because that's not going to end well, right? If you're thinking about trying to reduce water waste, think about the vehicle you're using to deliver the water to the agricultural product or whatever. Is it going to break down in 10 years? Think about the long-term life cycle, anticipate the regulatory environment, the environmental aspects. And for all those problems, you're usually within the sciences working with multidisciplinary teams, but stretching it so that you actually are considering the broader social, business, regulatory context within which the work you're doing is going to have impact, means that you'll be wanting to work in those bigger teams. And we found that one of the best vehicles for us to achieve this was to work with industry as well, right? So in Australia, we often talk about the limitations on universities' ability to translate research into commercial outcomes or into direct economic benefit. And we often talk about industries' concerns about working with universities because we tend to be more interested in the quality of our science than we are in the applications. Well, if you bring that multidisciplinarity together with industry helping to identify what are the problems we're trying to address, and governments identify what are the priority areas that governments want to support, then you're much more likely to get those connections working through. And you're much less likely to focus simply on the quality of the science. That's not to say you don't care about the quality of the science, but you want to make sure that you're doing science that has impact. And I think it's a focus on impact that makes those multidisciplinary collaborations much more effective. It's been fantastic for us. We've now got people working on good governance in renewable energies. We've had people looking at social attitudes in relation to water treatment. We've got people looking at, how do we understand in the case of trying to support water quality in the Ganga? I mean, what does the cultural value of this very important body of water mean for the people who live and work within it? And so I think if you don't have those pieces, you're not as likely to have solutions which are going to work. It's been a fantastic project. We currently have about 20 PhD students. Most of them are more technical, I would quite happily say, but all of them are informed by that question of how are we going to take it to the next step, and how are we going to really strengthen that. We've got another 20 projects up for grabs, and we're hoping to have 80 PhD projects going by 2027.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Now, this is the last question. Then we're going to have questions from our audience, both online and in person here. And the last question is one for all of you to answer, and that is basically we've gotten a sense of the different issues, the time, the kinds of perspectives, all of that. We've got industry, training, all of that. What do you think are some of the key challenges and opportunities, underexplored areas that one can focus on between the two countries? And most importantly, how do we actually speak and convince both the policymakers of the two governments as well as universities, both of which have the resources and the possibility of allocating them in certain. How do you get them to allocate resources in these sorts of areas which require a broader perspective beyond STEM? So what are some of the key principles that you would identify to inform this change? And I'll start in this order, in this list with
Thank you for the opportunity to kick this one off. Now, if I were being cheeky, I'd say, that's a really good question. What do you people think? But I will have a go at answering. So the question is, how do you change the priorities from where we are now, the funding priorities, the strategic priorities, and so on? Because the challenges, I think, are fairly well known. And the good experiences in some areas are well known. That the Indian End wrote an Australian economic strategy, is absolutely to be applauded. And what came out of it is just so crystal clear as to what we need to have more of. And Ambassador, you highlighted some of these points. So to some extent, it's already there on the table as to what are the key things that we should be concentrating on. And I'm not going to try and rehearse that list. So I'm going to look at it from the point of view of saying, okay, how do you change people, be they in government or in industry or in universities, from what they're doing now to something else? I'm rephrasing your question and turning it into something rather personal. And I would suggest there's a list of things, but sort of 2 or 3 stand out very, very clearly. Firstly, and again, I won't be cheeky and say whatever idea you put on the table, you've got to put it in such a way that they think they thought of it first. So I'm not going there into simple-minded things like that. But you do have to be able to engage in this conversation that says it's the end effect that we're trying to get. And how do we get more of it, if you like, in the great Gandhian engineering tradition, for less? Or how do we get more of it for what we're doing at the moment? So let me give you a specific example to highlight this. So if I were talking the Australia-India Strategic Research Fund, which has been going for a long time and with quite some impact, the most obvious thing would be to say, if it were to include the social sciences as well as straight science and engineering, would it be able to deliver more of its principal objective? And the answer is undoubtedly yes. And you would think of examples such as how you handle the energy transition and several others. So I'm answering your question by being very specific and saying, this is about influencing the influencers. And I don't mean by doing it on social media and getting a higher number of counts. And the principle I would espouse is that if we move boundaries a bit to encompass others and then stand back and watch results. So I've given you a very practical one, especially for the AISRF. We'll see where we end up.
Thank you, and patience too, and giving time, right? Yes.
Yeah, I don't know if I have anything that pragmatic. Definitely the point on the patience, but I'm also thinking, given all of these examples, maybe some kind of venue where to give that prominence. But I also think there's work to be done, at least on the Indian side, about persuading people of the importance of this at the national level first, before we then, take it to a collaboration. And I'll say a little bit more about what I mean. There's a lot of promise in technology and hope invested in technology in the Indian case. But one of the things we are observing is, for instance, because of the interest in AI, for instance, our idea of who the experts in a field are is also shifting a little bit, I feel. Because we now have the computing power and the data to do some of these things. The only people we see as experts sometimes tend to be AI folks, right? So I think one of the starting points for me also needs to always include what we traditionally used to call the subject matter experts. So if we are looking at AI in agriculture, cannot have that conversation without experts in agriculture. It seems like a very intuitive and maybe too small a thing to mention, But given this movement that's happening, at least on the Indian side, I don't know what it looks like in the Australian side. I would say, first of all, I think making that a concrete bedrock principle that you cannot have these conversations without that kind of diversity at the table at the national level. And then, as people become persuaded of the value of that diversity, I think scaling it up and across borders would also become simpler. I think that's the most pragmatic thing I can come up with.
Very good at sharing here. And I think but that's part of it is the development of trust and the development of confidence. So I think there are policy settings and frames that can encourage people to look over the fence. But I think it's the experience, the relational experience of working together on, clearly working on those defined outcomes, as Robin was suggesting, of what we're hoping to achieve, but recognizing there's lots of different ways of approaching that problem and developing confidence in groups around whether it's AI with the agricultural experts or between the social sciences and the technological sciences around a particular issue, but really getting people to have a sense that it's okay that we're going to stumble a little bit, that we're going to trip on each other a little bit, but that we still want to get to that goal. And I think that kind of developing of trust and confidence, and not having, for example, if we are going to have policy settings to create incentives, not have them stop after the first 6 months or the first try if we have anything other than perfect outcomes. So I think it's building that resilience and capability would be the most important part.
So I think much has been said already, and I think it's important that we summarize this. In my view, I think it's important to have a combined approach of academia, industry, and government. There are 2 or 3 ways in which this can be done. If you asked me about a few years ago, it was basically a conversation between the academia. But now there's a very strong conversation happening between the governments as well. We have a policy framework, of research collaboration between India and Australia at the governmental level. What, in my view, is lacking is involvement of industry a little bit, and that must be strengthened. It's there, but it must be strengthened in the future, because only if it is there, we'll be able to identify which are the areas that India and Australia want to work in collaboration, which can also take into account in a holistic manner what the humanities or social sciences are, which impact the society of today in India and in Australia. And for that to happen, I think it's very important. I think time has come to set up a small working group, which comprises of the 3 elements together, identified by both sides, and they look at 10 areas to begin with. Something of this similar nature has been done in the MOU which we have signed on migration and mobility in May of 2023. Now, in that, there are 2 or 3 important points which I'd like to highlight. One is, of course, the question of identification of people who are beginning entrepreneurship, for example. They will be encouraged, for example, by the Australian side, of course, in this case, 3,000 of them over 4 years to come and work on specific fields in Australia. It's called MATES, by the way. And the areas which have been identified are about 8 areas. The list will be expanded later. But those are critical areas in which we are collaborating today, in which there are demands and deficiencies in the society. As we go along, we can add to that list in future, not in terms of that MOU, but we should be doing that in terms of our WET MOU and including those areas in that, for instance, and later on also upgrading the academic collaboration that we are doing between each other, between universities, etc. What will happen through that is that we will be fulfilling the needs of each other in society. Now, I'll give you a couple of examples. I think I already gave an example of logistics, for example, and critical technology and logistics, for instance. or AI for digital technologies in business, etc. But what we also need, for example, looking at cybersecurity, we have a cybersecurity MOU between the two countries. But it's not just the technology part of it, but also the social impact of cybersecurity or lack of it, which has on the society. So that aspect of it requires an interdisciplinary approach. It's not just technical approach. And this is just a concrete example. So this can only be done if we have all three components, industry in particular, along with government and academia, sitting together and identifying these areas.
Thank you. And the last word and comments from Chris, Dr. Hatherley.
Well, thank you. No, I mean, to add to what colleagues have said previously, and I agree with all the points that have been made. I think there's an increasing recognition, certainly within the Australian government, but also internationally, about the need for collaboration across and within disciplines to solve some of the key social challenges. The Australian Chief Scientist, Robin's successor, Dr. Kathy Foley, is in the process of finalising a new set of national science and research priorities. This is an update on the previous priorities, which were set in 2015. And the draft priorities are all about big social and environmental issues that will inherently require collaboration across the disciplines, but also collaboration across country borders. Australia, the point was made that Australia produces 3% of the world's knowledge. That's, punching above our weight, but it also means Australia imports 97% of its knowledge to solve some of these problems, is reliant on the 97% of knowledge that's produced elsewhere. So, looking at some of those national priorities in Australia, looking at the national priorities that are being developed and endorsed elsewhere, and looking for the kind of areas of alignment is really fertile ground, I think, for engaging those decision makers in opportunities for new collaborations and new country partnerships.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chris. I think we'll now take some questions from our audience online and in person. I might take the liberty of starting with questions, with one question in person, and then take any questions that might be coming up online. So, is there any question, anyone in this audience? Professor Yali Shetty, Robin has been referring to you. Would you like to make some comments?
Thanks, and it is a pleasure to my ears. It was a delight to listen to some of the wisdom of the great panelists who are here. So I'm Mohan Yalishetty from Monash Uni. I'm an associate professor. My area is critical minerals. As Professor Batterham alluded to, critical minerals are key ingredients that underpin, the transition to cleaner and greener energies. So whenever we get into public discourses, one of the important stumbling blocks, I would say, is all these collaborations are good and they must happen. They should happen at a speed at which, they never happened before. These are all fine. But on the other side, the flip side of it is governments are, allocating very little buckets of money. Collaborations need some long-term commitment from whichever governments are trying to partner. So what should happen? And also, even if you look at Professor Batterham is the right person to comment on this, perhaps ARC, if you look at the bucket of money is shrinking over a period of time. So is it that academia, industry, government collaboration that will fill in the shortage that we would see in the typical government buckets? So yeah, I would like to hear some of their comments.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let me just add one to that and just follow this line of having industry more involved. You have some quite remarkable examples of companies in India that over a long period of time have worked very well on the interface between whatever their business interests are and the wider community, including the research and education side. And without rehearsing a long list, but the Tata Group would be an obvious example here. And I think part of the answer as to how to make these things happen, because there are ever increasing demands. By the way, for a little diversion, of course there are ever increasing demands. I mean, just think about the rate of expansion of knowledge. And the more knowledge expands, the more opportunities there are to expand knowledge and its applications and what have you. I mean, this is just a bit of elementary information science, actually. And hence the demands for new areas always exceed the existing demand. And that applies whether you're a government, whether you're a company, whether you're a university or whatever. So one has to have a mindset that says, okay, in an ever expanding world of opportunity and of information, what are we going to focus on? And that means always changing what you're currently focusing on. Now, some things prevent us doing that. And the inherited university system, and with due respect to where it came from, whereby it's only faculties that can certify a degree. So you have a faculty of science, you have a faculty of engineering and information technology in this university, etc. And if you want to have a joint degree between science and engineering, you've got to get, let alone across the so-called divide, you've got to get two faculties to actually agree it. And if you want to publish, you've got to find a journal which recognizes both as being worthwhile rather than a contribution which fits between them as being second rate to either one or the other. You know, there's so many inherent challenges in this, but I come back to the basics and say we're in ever changing, ever faster, so you have to change the way we go about things. It's as simple as that. We've quite frankly just got to be more inventive in dreaming up things which people will see as opportunities. Now you can say this is extraordinary political approach or super pragmatic or what have you. The answer is yes, it is, but it will get change. So identifying opportunities and then talking to the people that can make them happen, and to come back to the point where I started on this, particularly with companies, because companies are waking up to the fact that it's not, as many have in the past, and I cited one example from India, that it's not just about the bottom line and the shareholders. It is much broader than that. And you can argue that ESG is off the rails and puts undue pressure in the wrong areas and so on. I'm not going to go there. It at least opens the doors to many other opportunities.
Can I come in on the question of funding? She goes bravely into the scary zone. I was part of the Australian government's independent review of the Australian Research Council Act, chaired by Margaret Shiel and with Mark Hutchinson from Adelaide University. And one of the things that we noted in that process is that the overall, and this has also been picked up in the Accord process in Australia, the overall amount of funding going to research and development in Australia is about half the OECD average. And so, and the proportion of that is through the competitive grant process is diminishing. So there's a real need in Australia for a bit of rethinking within industry about where it gets its ideas from. And I think Chris's point before was that very often Australian researchers do really fantastic stuff. It goes around the world, gets developed, and comes back as a product we purchase. And we could shorten that chain a little bit. But it's also the case that if industry picks up more of the investment in research and development, which is a challenge for a country with relatively small number of major industry, mostly small and medium enterprises. So we need to collaborate with someone to be able to do this. If Australia does that, we still need that fundamental research in order to be able to have something which we then develop, apply, and translate. So it's getting that whole system to work well. And what's the role of these sorts of collaborations is partly to keep us looking to the future, which I think is Robin's point, that we need to keep looking about not just funding that which has been successful in the past, but where we need to go, but also making sure we've got the full value chain considered as we go through that process. Very unusual statement for a philosopher to make, but I do think we need to be thinking about that funding cycle much more.
Thank you so much.
I want to add something to this here because when the Australia Economic Strategy report was being prepared, one important discovery that we made was, as far as India is concerned, the funding was shifting a lot already from the government to industry at that point in time. And over the past few years, I've seen the funding from government become less and less and less as far as universities are concerned. So that has to be made up, obviously, from industry. The other trend which we discovered was that Indian industry was funding research more abroad than within India, within Indian institutions. But that trend is now changing as well. They're funding more within the country itself. So when Australian universities are looking at collaboration with their Indian counterparts, I think that joint collaboration should tap industry both in Australia and in India, because that gives more confidence not only to the universities, but also to the industry on both sides, because you have a joint collaboration going, and that project should be then offered, or it should be vice versa, and industry, whatever the needs are, that research should then be taken up by the joint collaboration. That's my suggestion.
If I could just build on that, if I may, just as a very specific example, this is why the critical minerals is such a good area.
Yes.
Because you've got companies on the Indian side, companies on the Australian side in different parts of the cycle. You've got universities on both sides with capabilities. So you've got the needs and the capabilities, and you actually have government interest in the area for geopolitical reasons. And this is not the only one, and it's perhaps not the necessarily the best example in that it's a very down the technical and scientific end, but nevertheless, it's so clear that there's industry interest and government and academic interest in it that we have to make that happen.
Chris, any comments?
Thank you. I'd like to pick up, I think, on a comment Susan made about the declining level of Australian investment in research and development as a percentage of our GDP. And to make the point that the Australian government has, as a target, it's not a policy target, and there's no time frame attached to this, but they have a stated aspiration, I guess, of trying to build that investment in R&D in Australia to closer to the OECD average of 3%. That was it's in the ALP policy platform. It was recently endorsed at their national conference again. So I think probably now more so than any other time, the Australian government is open to ideas about increasing R&D investment over the next, probably 10 to 15 years is a realistic timeframe for this. And also open and understanding of the fact that that kind of level of increase in investment, and it's in the order of, doubling almost what we've got at the moment, so $20 to $30 billion of additional investment from public and private sources per annum, that's not going to come in the form of small project grants or small scheme. It's going to have to be in bigger kind of thematic, collaborative, ideally international programs. So what we've been doing within the Academy of Social Sciences and other places, collaboration of other university peak bodies as well, is to really try and think big picture about what could be proposed, what could be put on the table by way of larger collaborative schemes, thematic schemes, which could help to really drive not just the investment level, that's the input, but particularly the outputs. What are we actually going to get from this kind of investment? How could we benefit Australia? How could we make this country more resilient in terms of its economy, its strategic alliances, its links with other partners. So I think there's actually cause for optimism at the moment, in my view. Things are hard. They're always hard in the research sector. There's never enough money to go around. But now, and perhaps over the next few years, there's more opportunity to really think about some of these ways that we could change things.
Thanks so much, Chris. I'm just wondering if we have any questions online, and Brianna, if you could perhaps read one out.
Hi, Priya. Yes. Hopefully you can see this screen. I've just shared them by text as well. I've identified a couple of questions, but perhaps the one on sport. Are there any research collaborations in the sports arena that are being explored? Sport is a great social leveler. Australia has always punched above its weight in the global sporting arena, and India is starting to emerge in the global sporting arena, although in niche areas. There are many opportunities for collaboration if explored properly.
Anyone who has any panel member who has some comments on this topic?
Well, firstly, let's not talk about cricket. Might be a sensitive topic. That's a very interesting question. And could I invite people here, and especially on the panel, to explore that and take a little further? Because there's, I mentioned earlier on, a very worrying trend on suicides. And it's part of a very worrying trend, to me anyway, on social fabric and somewhat the disintegration of social fabric. And I'm not going to get into a big, deep discourse on it, but I will point out that one of the most elementary things that you can do to help the front end of mental illnesses is to get people physically active. Now, if sport isn't getting people physically active, what is? So you could argue very pragmatically that post-COVID, and leaving aside Instagram and TikTok, looking at some trends that are happening, is a crying need for more sport engagement, physical engagement. How do you make that happen? What could India offer here that comes out of what appeals there? What likewise in Australia? Now, I very deliberately said keep cricket out of it, although there's nothing wrong with cricket. The more people, the more children playing cricket in the streets, the better. And you will see less suicides as a result.
Yeah, so I want to add something to the sports collaboration. I think we've identified where the collaborations can take place, of course. But the way this has gone is that, the government-to-government conversation has progressed further, but the private sector conversations have been very limited. The reason is that most of the facilities in India are in government hands. So it has to be a decision of the state government, for instance, to convert, I'm taking an example like a cricket stadium, and to use it for various other purposes, like you do here in Australia. The stadium is not just for playing cricket, but it also is used for events or banquets and dinners, etc., so that it earns revenue, and at the same time, it becomes a place of social gathering, etc. So the Delhi government has made some beginning in that. Not much has been done in other places. There are a few sports academies that have come up, especially in northern India, which have collaboration with Australia now, but those are limited. We also need a lot of collaboration in sports medicine. We also need collaborations in sports equipment and then related technologies, etc. So what has happened in the sports equipment side is that the sports manufacturers want to sell and export rather than work together and manufacture. They don't want to take that last step because that confidence is not there as yet. But I think as there is much more exchange of sports. Now we have enormous amount of exchanges in cricket, in hockey, for instance. in squash, but other than that, I don't see much happening in the other fields. So that's something which the governments have to encourage the private sector to take the lead and also have that conversation, maybe in the context of the India-Australia Business Forum or other such forums where they can encourage the companies who are involved in the sports field to start talking to each other. It's one of those very specific niche areas, but it has a lot of scope.
And thank you. And apologies to any of my colleagues from La Trobe who may be listening. And if I've forgotten about a partnership you may have in India, I apologize in advance. But La Trobe has some really fantastic sports facilities that we've just recently opened up, and they range in their role from community sport. On Saturday morning, it's deafening with very small people running around following balls, through to elite sport, to Paralympians, to rehabilitation and so on. And at the moment, the Afghanistan women's football, by which I mean round ball, team use that facility as well as the Matildas. So it's a really fantastic opportunity for us to develop our sports science, sports medicine, but also to look at the way that helps relatively disadvantaged and socially isolated members of the community to participate effectively. We have really strong relationships at the moment with Sheffield Hallam University, for example, in the UK. I don't know if we've thought about building out our relationships into India, and I think it's a really fantastic opportunity, in part because the cohort of Melburnians who participate at Bandura are more likely to reflect that broader range of community members who may have relatively limited access to, coming in to use a really bad metaphor, on a level playing field in terms of being engaged in the community and getting the health benefits. So I think that broader public health value, as well as a sense of social inclusion and participation in civic activity that comes through sporting facilities, is really one that could be explored further. But as you say, it's one where there may not be an immediate industry need that they can see as being associated with that broader approach. If you're focusing on the being able to sell a particular pair of runners as a result of seeing an elite game, it's getting that recognition all the way through. There's many more small people who need equipment than there are elite athletes.
Thank you. Chris, any comments?
Nothing to add on this one. Thank you.
Okay. We have. Sorry. Yes.
No, sorry. It was a question.
Do you have
to ask a question?
2 minutes? Okay. We've just been told to remember that. I'm looking at that clock over there. So, yeah, please do go ahead and ask.
So,
the last question.
Thank you. So I work for an industry-led organization, and just having heard your comments, so I work with both a private hospital in India and a public hospital here in Australia. And being an industry representative, there's a lot of limitations in terms of trying to get them to collaborate in clinical trials, clinical research, patient outcomes, etc., using real world data. India's strength being its technology, and Australia's strength being its governance and regulations. So is there kind of, firstly, any framework or strategy to recognize the strengths and then kind of adopt or, learn from each other's strengths to grow these kind of collaborations? Because I think that's where there needs to be kind of more synergies. Do you guys, I'd like to hear your thoughts on if there's scope for that already happening or will be happening.
Yeah, so in the healthcare sector, there's an enormous amount of areas that have been identified. Of course, it ranges from clinical research and cancer research and, care for the mentally handicapped, for instance, or pediatric care, or the elderly, specific medicines, for example, nuclear medicine. More importantly, there is a big gap in India on codification. For example, when somebody goes into a hospital, every time they walk into a different hospital, the ailment is registered in a certain different manner. So they don't carry their health record from one place to another. It's not linked from one place to another. So that doesn't help you in tracing pandemics, for instance. Now, there are many countries in the world. Australia is one of them, and United States is the other that India is looking at for adapting a codification system. And it's a huge area of collaboration. And any hospital or group of hospitals or even the healthcare system which collaborates will be in India for a long period of time working on this. And many other opportunities can arise from there. So I would suggest that you look at that in particular. That struck me as something which is quite odd, that for a huge population like this, we don't have that standardization codification. But other than that, I think there is a lot which has been already identified. So I would recommend that you read the chapters in the report, but that'll give you a lot.
Thank you. I think we just about run out of time. And unless there's something our panelists would like to add to that question, no?
I was just going to say to the point on codification too, and more broadly, even beyond health, data protection is something that all countries have been thinking about, and there have been a lot of active comparisons. In fact, I think the person who brings out a comparison every year is based in Australia. Graham Greenleaf does a lot of comparison between data protection regimes, including in health. And I know people in India are looking at both codifying electronic health records, but also where does that data then go? And what can we learn from how others have thought about this?
Chris, any last words?
Thank you. Nothing from me, just thanks for the opportunity to be part of the panel and the great discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So thank you all for being part of the event, and thank you especially to all of you for contributing your ideas and your thoughts, and really valuable. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank all of you in the audience, both in person and online, for taking part and staying with us and being interested in this issue. I'd like to, as we wrap up, I'd like to thank our team at the Australia India Institute here, Hari Nandini, Brina Barrett, who's been absolutely crucial in organizing all of these events, including this one. And Daryl here, Daryl Moore and Parth, and many more of us who've been working in the background. Thank you all for making this such a wonderful event. And we just, every time we have these discussions, I always think, keeping the dialogue going, keeping the discussion going is a very important thing. It makes us always want to talk and then try and push, the boundaries somewhere, somehow, and change happens. So thank you, and we just hope we keep this conversation going. Thank you, Professor Yali Shetty, also for your comments, and thank you all. That today's session has been recorded and will be made available on our Australia website. So thank you again, and bye-bye.